Are you listening?
This is the Rob Scott Show.
Damn.
I mean, really, like, if we're not trying to change the world, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Rob Scott Show. I am Rob, and I am here with Sarah. How you doing, Sarah?
Good to see you. Excited to record this one with you
It's
today.
good to see you. It's like we both have permagrins on right now. I don't know what
Yeah.
that is, but it's nice. Like, yay, giggle time. All right. I think we both love doing this. So, what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, so this episode, I thought that we could kind of dig into reality and not necessarily, deciding what's real and what's not, but kind of looking at different assumptive platforms and how we interpret what's true and just kind of pulling back the veil a little bit more on these meanings that we kind of have cemented into our ways of being and how we can just be more flexible with it. So I'm excited. Does
Yeah,
that sound good?
I love it. Yeah, I love it. So there's a lot there. I mean, we could talk about like illusion and delusion, maybe the difference between those. I think what I would want to highlight in a talk like that is that it feels as though we are directly relating to fact and truth, and that there's this stack of everything from like what we sense and perceive as far as vision and sound and smells and all these things, and all the way up into like how we feel and think, and then how we choose to behave. And if we're talking about meaningfully changing behavior in some way that's meaningful, it's really helpful to realize that like way down in that stack, we may not be dealing directly with reality in the way that we think we are. And so one of the quickest paths to changing is to have a deep realization about that, and then learn how to manage that differently and understand it more. Because once a negative emotion comes up, one that's hard to deal with or whatever, our impulse is that whatever we're feeling is factual, it's real, it often feels more permanent than it is, right? There's all these things. But evolution didn't necessarily set us up to interact directly with fact. And I hope we can dissect that a little bit so I can show what I mean by that. But more than that, I think in the collective, when we're all kind of looking at reality, and to a big degree, what I'm trying to argue for is that we're much more dealing with the movie that's in our own head than we are any shared reality out there. And yet the assumption that we make is that we're all dealing with this same reality. And so when I see it differently than you must be crazy. Like, why don't you see it the way I see it? And so deeply learning how much we are distorting and excuse me, messing with things, or how those things are messed up in our perception, can be really helpful to gain wisdom and understand what's actually going on for us.
Yeah, and these, we record these kind of well, not kind of. We definitely record these unscripted. So, on a topic like this where there's so much, I just want to
Mhm.
kind of want to fire back my thoughts on it too, which is that it's almost a catch 22 what you're saying, right? Because societally or collectively, even, we've talked about relating even, more than one person, you and I,
Mhm.
we don't live in the same physical place. So our actual physical quote unquote realities are very different. And so a lot of, like you were saying, a lot of what's actually happening is the story of our perception in our own head that we think is shared. Um and
Well, then,
how
yeah, sorry, I didn't want to
Oh, I
interrupt you,
was
but
just gonna say,
also,
and how when that works, that's fine, right?
yeah,
But when it doesn't work, and then it's really hard if you can't see what's kind of the assumptive platform, so to speak, or what you're deciding is true and the other person is deciding true, and
mhm.
that's different. Like, it's really hard to fix when it's broken.
Yeah, totally. And then also in a space where you and I mean, we've seen each other literally a handful of times together in real space, but we see each other every day in virtual space. And so not only are our realities very different in that I'm on one coast and you're on the other, but we're also, all of us, more and more and more screens are taking up a huge part of our reality and our meaning making and what we think is happening in the world. And so to whatever degree we're watching similar things, maybe we end up with a closer shared reality if we're both reading the same news or in the same groups or whatever. But to way more of a degree than we realize, you're seeing very different things than I'm seeing, right? What the algorithms are feeding you and what your news choices are very different than mine. And yet our assumption is that we're all dealing with this very standard reality out there. And we don't realize how much we're drifting away from that or not directly in touch with that, how much of that is illusionary, how much of that is being manipulated by motivations and we're actually being lied to, or how much is just mistake and all that stuff. And so it's not that necessarily we even need to get this perfectly, but having a deep realization of how much your own construction of reality is a part of that allows a whole function of wisdom and managing, emotions and thoughts and behaviors and all the things that sort of matter to us as people. You can gain this huge jump in wisdom if you sort of wake up to how much of that is a co-creation of your perception and what we might call reality out there.
Yeah, do you remember what I said to you when I met you in person for the first time
And didn't you
after about
say,
a year of knowing
yeah,
you?
yeah, yeah, yeah. You're like, you're taller than I thought. Wasn't that what you
Yeah, I
thought?
was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, you have legs. You're so tall."
Yeah.
Because when you Zoom with someone, you feel like everyone's your height because you're
Yeah.
looking at, from kind of their shoulders up. And so I met you and I was like, "Oh," and you're
Yeah.
like, "I'm not that tall. I'm regular height." I'm
Yeah.
like, "Oh,
You,
okay."
but
I'm just confused because you
you
have
had
legs.
yeah, right, right. All of a sudden there's legs that didn't exist
Yeah.
before. That's awesome. um yeah, so I mean, some of the things that come to mind are all these like perceptual illusions that we have, right? And so if we think about one assumption that most people would make, I would say, is that what I'm seeing in the moment is really what I'm seeing in the moment. But a lot of that can be very much played with. We've talked about how different wavelengths and photons, which really are just energy, kind of hit the eye, but then that fires a neurochemical, electrochemical reaction in the neuron that fires into my brain. And then there's all this extra brain function that isn't just representing exactly what I see, it's actually constructing, things like color and depth and different perceptions and all that. And we have all these ways where our mind is filling in a lot of the meaning to fit a perception rather than actually being a true perception of what is. And so visually, we're all in touch with, I would hope, we've probably seen visual illusions where it can look like an old woman or a younger woman, depending on how you see it, or one side of it's a bunny and the other side's a duck, depending on how you look at it. And we've talked before about how context, if I set you up, or it's actually called in psychology priming, right? If I prime you a certain way, you're going to fill in the gap, more aggressively or immediately or reflexively one way other than than another way that you might, should the context have been different. And so all of these things go into making up what we ultimately perceive via our senses and our own attentional filters to be very, very, very different. So to make that simpler, a conversation with a married couple, right? They have very different memories of what was said often. It's like, no, I told you that already. And it's like, well, no, you didn't. And yes, I said this, but oh, I didn't hear that, or no, I didn't. And, wisdom there is sort of navigating that with care and going, well, you may have said it, but I didn't hear it. And so let's care for both of those, right? And like, neither of us have to be wrong, but let's revisit it. But what we end up doing instead is thinking, this person doesn't care about me. They're not really listening. They're not really hearing me, all that. And what's actually happening is a whole lot more in our perceptual filters and our meaning making to leave us more confused and separate rather than cooperative and together.
Yeah, and just kind of to slow, to go back and kind of go through all of that because I
Yeah.
felt like there's a lot there. Even like, I'm curious to talk about the perception of, like you were saying, even how the example I think we talked about is how we hear and see. So you could
Hmm.
kind of know that there's kind of a delay because you can see something happen far away and then the sound, you have to wait for the sound to travel into
Yeah.
your ears. So that literal, like, how do we interpret sensation, right? And how
Hmm.
and what kind of meaning do we put to that? And then, you talked about the collective and kind of this idea of truth. So an example of that, I mean, like, what we decided, this plastic square is a credit card, which means that it has value, which means it's hooked to a bank account,
Yeah.
which is just numbers on a screen to most of us, right? We're not like
Hmm.
looking at our stacks of dollar bills, which is, just following that trail. So collectively, beyond just like, how do we interpret sensations, the things we hear and see and smell, and and what meaning do we do there? But then how does that like kind of solidify into then how we interact with each other on like an individual friendship or couple? But like, how does that impact what we decide like globally as a society? I mean, it really does have implications. We talked about how if we can do this better, we have expanded wisdom or something.
Mm-hmm.
And you had talked about either on the podcast or you have talked about in coaching how kind of what we see this next evolution of humans are this ability to kind of come in and out of more perspectives than just like this is the truth and I can't
Yeah.
see anything different. It really does have implications at almost every level, alone out in the woods somewhere, one-on-one with a friend or a partner in a house, collectively as a society, and then like the structures and the systems that like we live, banking, politics,
Mm-hmm.
healthcare, like all this kind of really does matter at every level.
It does. I mean, let's start really granular, right? So, in one sense, like each of your eyes has a blind spot, and there's actually like a way to find this blind spot. And so, if people are just listening, if you're driving, obviously don't do this right now or whatever. But when you get a minute, one way you could do it is if you were to cover your left eye, or just close your left eye and hold your thumb out at arm's length, and with your right eye, hold your left thumb out, like do opposite hands here for a second, right? So you're looking at your left thumb with your right eye and your left eye is closed. If you then keep staring at that eye, but you hold your right thumb out next to it and you very slowly move it away, at some point that thumb actually vanishes, usually about 6 inches away. There's a certain degree away where that thumb actually vanishes. And play with that with some time. And what you'll start to see is that there's actually a blind spot in your eye. And it's true for both eyes. What happens is, obviously, both our eyes there are helping to fill that space to give us a more continual view of things. But we almost completely ignore that vanishing point. And what you'll notice is that the thumb disappears, but the whole background doesn't, right? Because what's happening is that background is actually being filled by the perception of what's going on in your mind to give you not some hole in your visual perspective. It actually fills in. So here's just one example of how we're not seeing exactly what's there, right? There's some difference between perception and reality, right? There's a reality where I'm not able to see right there, but my brain tells me I can see right there. So that difference in that one little example is like, okay, so what? We've overcome that in certain ways, but that represents this process that we are constantly saying and taking in truth about the world. And if we go up the stack of not just perceiving visually, but what somebody said that meant something, right? And we've talked in the past how that ends up getting recorded as a memory of knowledge, right? I know what was meant by that person. I perceive that to be a certain thing. There's some emotional slight to it. There's some whatever. And we're potentially adding extra onto that may or may not be exactly what they meant, or even what was actually said, because we don't even hear accurately all the time. Like we'll hear an inflection.
Or even
that,
what we saw, though,
totally,
going back to the site,
Mm-hmm.
eyewitnesses, seeing is believing. Like we value, did you see it? Were you there? Did you see it with your own eyes? Like we value that as like kind of our absolute truth. Well, I saw it. I was there. I watched it happen with my own eyes.
And then you have the reinterpretation of the memory, though, right? So now, now you're coming back to a memory that is, your best attempt at like going back to what happened or whatever, but then that gets put into a category and it was good or bad. And so that flavors how we remember it and what was happened. And there's almost, clearly in time, there's no literal way to go back and actually recreate it in any way. So to whatever degree that we are not perceiving accurately, if we don't know that, that's the difference, is like the stance and like assuredness of meaning. We keep calling it that, right? If I'm just believing what I perceive to be exactly right, we have a difference there between truth and my perception. And it's a great wisdom move to just learn that and know that, and then start to learn on all these different stacks of what the brain is up to as far as perceiving and emoting and thinking and behaving. Where am I maybe off a little bit? And if I start to know where I'm off a little bit, I'm then not lost in the delusion of, I know exactly what it meant, I know exactly what it was, and I can get more free. So you started off talking about assumptive platforms, right? If something means something to me, that then shades all kinds of future decisions, and we tend to call that an assumptive platform, right? I don't then reconsider the platform, and all of a sudden, months down the road, we're still thinking in a certain way, and we don't remember even why we got to that kind of thinking. And so I think there's an old example of that. If I could just keep talking for 1 second, the old saying about this is, in today's world, this husband comes to his wife and the wife cuts off the ends of the ham before she cooks it. And the husband's like, why are you cutting off the ends of the ham? Oh, well, that's the way you cook a ham. He's like, well, why? And she's like, I don't know. Let me ask my mom. Right. So she calls her mom, and her mom's like, I don't know why. That's how I was taught to do it. Like, that's the best way to cook a ham, right? It's the way to cook a ham. And so she's like, wow, I'm really curious too. My mom taught me that. So she calls the grandmother, and the grandmother's like, oh, well, the old hams didn't fit in our old little oven. So I had to cut off the ends to cook, the ham that could fit in the oven. But yet now we've taught each other this assumptive platform of like, that's how you cook a ham. And we forget the whole way that we even got to that perception or that reality, whatever. So to a great degree, the self-world model that we're throwing onto this moment has all of these assumptive platforms of meaning and perception and all these different things. And I'm here to share that we are often deeply away from direct reality. And, the hope is that the defense of the self is always, well, I'm perceiving it right. I've got the right map. You don't, you're the one that's wrong, et cetera. And so this leads to all the conflicts, all the upset. And then personally, when we don't know that we're doing this, we get overly emotional or overly hurt or old persistent thinking that isn't helping us, right? That might have made perfect sense when we were 5, right? Like, I'm not powerful and I had a bad day, becomes I'm not powerful and I'm not a good person, through our whole life, rather than being re-examined and get closer back to what's real.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason I enjoy these recording these episodes with you is we kind of talk about everything from very broad to very specific. And I want to point out that I think the importance of looking at kind of pinpointing where this initially happens, either at site or whatever, and where these assumptive platforms are built, is because it's really kind of the seed for change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because so many people come to us way down the line, and you're a talented coach and you trace it back and you're like, well, it's this, this seed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's so hard when it's manifested into something ugly or something that we don't like and that's not working for us to fix on an individual level, right? So because we have then muscle memory built in. Let's say it's not cutting the ends off the ham, but it's having a drink when we're stressed, or binge eating food, or being quick to get angry at a partner or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. Collectively, let's say that ham is like racism.
Mm-hmm.
These things, even once it's brought to light, if they've been, the longer they are an assumptive platform, like you said, and they're not reconsidered, and they are, this is reality, this is truth, so and so saw it with their own eyes, the harder it is, even when we say like, oh, that's funny, we've been wasting ham,
Totally.
of course people with different color skin are the same,
right.
But it's then very hard because of all these other things we've talked about, impulses, your connection between your thought, your thoughts, feelings, emotions, behaviors, that to be able to actually change that. So
Mm-hmm.
people can have this kind of wake up, but if they can't see that reality / true / meaning isn't as concrete as they think, then it's like, even if you know it, like we've also
Mm-hmm.
talked about the difference between knowing and applying.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you know something, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can change it. And I think collectively, society, that's really what we're up against, that I see in the year of 2020, 2021. It's like, we're not quite sure how to change these things that have kind of just been ingrained in us, and we're having to adjust in a lot of different ways. So it's
yeah. So
interesting.
if we talk about belief as assuredness of meaning, which is my favorite definition for how I try to talk about belief, right? What I mean in that moment is, it may not be right, but if I am assured that that's right, then I believe that to be quote unquote truth, right? We are not aware at how often we are limited in our perspective. We are not aware how what we heard wasn't what everybody heard. We're not aware of my own sort of learned, or what my culture or my parents taught me is right. It's a quickness that's a huge efficiency of the brain to just take these, what I call heuristics or meanings, and not have to reconsider them, right? So we take this room, we've talked about, can you see a refrigerator without knowing it's a refrigerator, right? That heuristic of the meaning of refrigerator out of my memory to know that has all these advantages that lets me use it and not have to like reconsider it. So this is amazing, right? This is a great function of the brain to do many of these shortcuts until the shortcuts are something like racism or huge political differences or a difference in your relationship with your partner or a difference about how you feel about yourself, right? The internal values conflicts we end up in ourselves. And if we can't reconsider those, if we can't quite literally, what that's going to feel like for a human is breaking up with your own truth, right? This is the act of actually challenging what we've taken in to be true about something. And why it's a wisdom move is that there's a position where once you can see how much you're involved in the construction, that you're implanting old ideas back onto things, that your own perceptual filters aren't that accurate, you can take a space of, maybe, maybe not, instead of I know for sure, right? That maybe, maybe not space allows me to hold what I think to be true and still act accordingly, et cetera, but leaves me more fluid should I meet resistance internally or externally to deal with that in a different way.
Yeah, I mean the fluidness of being able to kind of see that, like have that added layer of wisdom is so useful. And the example that it comes to mind, and we've talked about this I think around the holidays as well, but being in a pandemic, when you're talking about what do we think of and what's true and what we're used to, like it's been so hard for me to adjust to being like eating at a restaurant is like a dangerous, could potentially be a more
Yeah.
dangerous activity. And I use that example because, it feels directly applicable to anyone, right?
Mhm.
This thing where it's a community thing where we're encouraged to do it, and it means socialization and supporting businesses and kind of maybe festivities. In your head you have to, it's hard to switch it to be like, okay, this is maybe not the like a safe activity to do at this time because you can't wear masks and whatever. But how I'm watching how it becomes either or, because my brain is so bad at breaking up with, it doesn't have that fluidness that you're talking about.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, well then, restaurants are bad, right? We've talked about duality. I
Right, right.
instantly want to slam it
Or
into
people who want to go to dinner are bad.
are
Like
bad.
how could they be
Right,
so
right,
thoughtless? That's so
right.
dangerous.
It's
And
so dangerous.
right, right,
Right.
right.
And
Yeah.
so like I also believe strongly that like all of these adjustments that we're doing to kind of navigate living through a pandemic as we are can be done better. Like I think there's still a way to communally gather in a safe way, maybe share food in a safe way, but not, it's not like gonna look like how what we, again, assumptive platforms. Well, at a restaurant you all sit at a table and you sit at these chairs, and it's
Mhm.
a server brings you food, and like there's a way to kind of bend things so you can still and get the fulfillment, the satisfaction, the joy, but not kind of be stuck into the narrative like, well, if I go out to a restaurant and it has to look like this and I have to sit here, it has to seem like this. And I'm watching how bad we are at it because
Mhm.
all these regulations are coming in and out, and then people are like building tents, so they're basically like recreating an inside restaurant inside of a tent, and it's like,
Right, right.
I don't think you quite got it, but like we're so bad at being able to kind of have that different, we'll say, reality, right,
Mhm.
of
Well,
what it is,
the
because
meaning making is a reflex, right? The what is this? Like, where am I? What's over there? What's that mean? All that is happening reflexively. And what we could give more examples of how that reflex is, either slightly or grossly in error, right? It's that reflex doesn't. So if we go back to evolutionary times, it feels, we might assume that because we feel like the most powerful beings on planet Earth, and there's lots of arguments for that, like everything that we're doing with tech and all that, it might feel as though, well, that's because we see reality better or more completely than all these other animals do, right? But our perception, our five senses, are so very limited in what they can see. And it's the shortcut is evolutionarily, if we take that frame and talk about it that way, fitness beats out reality actually every time. There's like mathematical models they've done to test that. Like if you put somebody in who can't self-delude can't lie and always has to do the rational thing, that doesn't beat the person that can just optimize outside of truth, delude itself, and actually work toward fitness. Fitness actually wins, right? So we're the most evolved in potentially fitness, of course, unless we extinct ourselves any day now, right? By some huge accident or whatever. But should we win this and stay peak predators on planet Earth, or peak beings on planet Earth, that is an argument for fitness more than it is for reality. And that's a really deeply important wisdom move to understand that the move to be selfish in the moment, right, at one level of complexity might really serve you. But when you only knew 150 people that also knew you, there were structures where that would also be exposed and like might be good for you as an individual, but wouldn't be good because people wouldn't trust you.
Right.
But now in the complexity we're in now, you might be able to scam people, 2 continents away and not have the repercussions of like your social club not hating you. And so we're not motivated and inspired in the same way. So we might end up in these things where we're acting badly, and it's just different. So like our wisdom has to grow with, we can't just say, okay, fitness is all we need, let's do this. And so for fitness purposes, you talked about sound and light being slightly different, right? At a distance, we can tell. Like if I'm at a baseball game and I'm way up in the nosebleeds, I can see that when the baseball hits the bat, the sound is a little bit delayed, right? Like, and when the difference is that big, we can notice that difference and we go, oh yeah, well, light travels faster than sound. But on very small
or like
distances,
fireworks, watching fireworks,
fireworks, right? On very small distances, that's still happening. That difference is there, but our brain like mashes it up all together and calls it now, right? But it's not actually now. Our brain had to do all that processing, and whether it's milliseconds or whatever it is, it's actually behind the moment, right? We're actually living kind of behind the moment, and we're certainly living consciously a little bit behind our impulses, right? The impulse is like ahead, and then we're doing this interpretive game on top of it. So even the idea of living in the now meaningfully is not exactly what we think it is, right? So there's a delusion, right? We don't see this one part visually, but our brain fills it in. There's another delusion. In nature, right? Let's talk about colors for a second, right? There is a wavelength that's yellow, but the reason that we see that is that we have 2 different light cones that are seeing yellow together, and making yellow. And so we could just see those 2 colors mashed up, or we could see the wavelength yellow and they would all be yellow. But purple is different because there is no wavelength of purple in physics. But when we see blue and red together, it hits our things, and our brain doesn't just break down and say, wow, that's an error. There's nothing there, or there's not a color there, or whatever. There's these 2 colors. It blends them together and it makes up purple, right? There literally isn't a purple wavelength out in reality. But what you see as purple, which, you might say, well, it's close to violet or whatever, but I'm talking when we blend blue and red, right? What's happening there is our 2 different light cones are causing together. And normally the intersection of that would be green, but because the green cone in our eye isn't seeing anything, it's going, well, this isn't green. So what is it? And it actually makes up another color that's a construction in our mind. And so there's some visual things, right? I was mentioning to you, I saw this video where the same sound, but if we close our eyes, we will consistently hear that one sound over and over again. And I think it's ba, right? The sound is ba, ba, ba. But if you put that with a face and have the guy do va, 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 or ba, ba, ba with the same sound, the brain will hear it 2 different ways. Like it'll add a V or a B at the beginning. And the reason for that is that the meaning making that our brain is doing, we can't consciously separate the sound and the visual, right? We're taking in a holistic meaning or a perception of what is going on in the moment. And that often can get blended, wrongly and erroneously. And so we could certainly learn ways to like play with that and do this illusion part of it. But what happens with a delusion, right, is once the illusion is a trickery where now we've tricked the mind and we've tricked the perception in some way. But delusion is when we believe that as fact, right? When we believe an error as a fact, now we're delusional. And so it might sound like a really sad argument, but it's good if you realize there's some potential way out of this or toward more wisdom. Almost all of the selves walking around are deeply in delusion, even if they seem like rational and are doing well, right? A lot of the construction of what they're creating in their mind is them believing facts about things that are not actually factual. And so again, we might say like visually, so what if we're tricked a little bit here and there, that's fine. But once we get up into the stack of relating, and once we get up into the stack of emotionally how we feel about ourselves and our own mentality and psychology and mental health generally, right? We start to get into much bigger errors where truly the human being can get all the way to suicide and kill itself because of things that it's believing about the world and about itself that are, I would argue, quite delusional. And so a path out of that delusion is to start seeing the perception muscle in all its erroneous things and then actually be almost thrilled at that, right? It's some kind of shortcut into a little bit closer to reality so that we can start going, oh, I don't see everything perfectly. I don't hear everything perfectly. And every feeling that I get might be an impulse, but I don't have to believe in how real it is or what I add on to it as meaning about myself and about the world. And to your point, to go back to collective structures like governance and money and all those things, if we're ever going to, meaningfully change those, we're going to have to be able to hack our own attachment to the truth of what gold meant, and gold was always the value thing, and so it'll always go back to that or whatever, like the different arguments that we end up believing in, right, that are just that, they're beliefs and they're maybe not actual, right? So our ability to start peeling that apart and seeing what parts of these are perceptions and what parts are reality is the move to figure out how we can get to wisdom.
Yeah, and I think it's just such a timely conversation to be having about reality and what we perceive as like right or whatever. Especially like, I mean, I don't think I could give a better example than like, how we eat with our family has become potentially a dangerous activity, right?
Right,
Like
right.
just kind of in the time we're in. And that is such a far departure from like, these other examples where it's like, oh, nothing bad's going to happen. Like people have gotten together, like died. So it's like, this is really something that we kind of have to be able to navigate. And we've talked about values
But
also.
notice, hold that for
Recently.
1 second. Just notice that you're saying that, and I bet there are some listeners that don't believe any of that, right? That their
Oh,
reality, their
totally. That
perception is,
I can wrap my head around it, right? To kind of prove the point of reality. It's like, what is that? Like,
yeah,
how can that even be quote unquote a reality? Because it's so far from like whatever I know. Like, I wonder if as a society and individually, if we can adjust instead of being right, like our value of being right and more about our value of being flexible,
yeah.
of being useful, of being kind of collectively thinking more of the collective instead of like I'm right. Because I wonder like how much, and I know that you often talk a lot about like what on prior to the self, right? We've talked about
Uh-huh.
how even self is kind of this
Yeah.
reflects this model, these memories, but kind of coming from the other way of how much is the collective telling me like the value here is to be right,
Mm-hmm.
to
Well,
above
think about
anyone
this.
else.
How
And
about like learning instead of knowing, right? That default to I know is
Mhm.
like, we really love that, right? That's what gives us certainty, and it's a huge psychological advantage to feel like you've got the facts, and we get very nervous when we don't know. Is there a way that we could start to value I enjoy learning more, right, instead of knowing?
Because we do that to ourselves. I mean, that's not like the nature saying like, you have to value, being right. That's like us saying like if you're wrong, right, you get like kind of strung up on social media, or if you're wrong, that becomes the one thing that becomes part of your identity. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
remember when Sarah said that thing and she was wrong, like especially living kind of in the cancel culture that we do, like any wrongness of any kind of public tribal, so to speak, expression can kind of stay with you, and
Well,
so
especially if you're claiming very loudly that you're right, right? So, evolutionarily, there's all kinds of advantages to being the one who knew something ahead and was right. And then, oh, well, we got to follow this. But I mean, that comes along with power and knowledge and all these great things. We know that as we learn things through science and we can use that knowledge more, right? Knowledge is power. We have those big statements. And I'm not saying knowledge isn't powerful. It certainly is. But in the way, in our psychological day-to-day life, this kind of clinging to knowing, instead of a clinging to I'm here to learn and continue to grow, right? One has this space that is, it allows growth. The other gets solidified into some fact that could be wrong, right? And if it's wrong, there's a lot at stake for when that's wrong. And so psychologically getting attached to learning instead of knowing, that would be a powerful mindset shift for people, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, and it would produce hugely different results, right? Like if your curiosity over pride, you know what I mean? It's like, oh my God, I didn't know that. Like, tell me more.
right.
What does that get? What kind of world does that look like? No, it's I think very differently.
Yeah,
than
for
where
sure.
we're at.
Well, and to your point, another one to hold, and it's not that like one necessarily beats the other and you don't ever have it, right? Knowing something can be useful in the moment, but being able to grow or add to what you know is also really helpful. But the other one you had is that kind of default to the individual win versus a collective win, right? When we see companies doing very well, often there's a culture there where the collective win is really appreciated by all the individuals, et cetera. In a family, if the family can win, that's usually a healthier family than, let's say, a selfish parent who only is jealous of their kids because their kids are so smart and they're now mad
Right.
and they're chopping down the kid or something, like that, right? So how can we notice the impulse of individual selfishness? I need to know, I have to hold, I have to be right, all these things. How can we see that impulse and notice it and honor it, but also break up with it, right? The meta move here is that we're constantly making meaning. There's a great usefulness to getting the meaning right and storing it and having it at our retreat. Like, I know what a refrigerator is, right? That's definitely useful. And it's good to know things, but also as that scales out to knowing what people think about you or what the best investment strategy is, or these things, right? That stuckness ends up, as complexity changes or we're dealing with other humans, we end up in very tricky situations by comparison, and having a space where we can not be so stuck in our assuredness of meaning. We can back up from our own believing, our own assumptive platforms, and reevaluate them consciously. That gives us a lot of space to rethink, our own psychology, how we get along with others, et cetera.
It really does. And I think maybe an interesting episode to record at a different time, but just to kind of tease it is language, because I think a lot of where we get trapped in meaning making, because you've talked, about heuristics and stuff, is language. And I can't wait till there's like a different word for assumptive platforms, because there is something so valuable about that biological kind of shortcut of storing a meaning, so you don't have to revisit it every time, but standing on it, like not long enough that it's platform to stand on, but enough that it's like more of a assumptive stepping stone, right? Like it's there to get you through a moment in time to the next moment in time where it might be something totally different.
Well, I
but
think just
we don't have that
consciously.
word yet.
No, well, I think we do. I mean, we've got heuristics and we've got a lot of words for these. I mean, this is exactly what we're trying to explore here, right? Like you and I do this in our business all the time, right? Like I will be 4 months later talking about the reason for a decision that we made. And it's like, oh yeah, but like we only chose that because Facebook was acting glitchy this one day. And so we were like, let's not focus on Facebook. And then, 4 months later, we're still not focusing on Facebook. And it's that we forget the assumptive platform there of like, we're not looking at Facebook right now or whatever, right? Like, let's not do paid ads or something because paid ads are too expensive. But then later I'll come back and say, hey, it's time to look at paid ads again. It's like, but I thought we weren't doing paid ads. It's like, well, that was just in that moment, right? So that consciousness to realize and then not stick to something simply because it's the assumptive platform that you're on, right? For any child who was brought up in a racist family and learned racism, right, that can very easily become an unconscious assumptive platform of how they judge everybody, right? Like, are you in my club or are you out of my club? What does it mean if you're out of my club? Are there levels to how bad you are, which other club you're in, right? All those different things that we can do. Any kind of growth from that and away from that has to reconsider the assumptive platform of what they were taught originally. And what I'm saying at a much more granular level, in every moment, the meaning that we're making is like a teaching that we're giving ourselves in all these micro ways, right? And we're, along with long cultural things that we've been taught that are very deep in our foundation, along with what we remember from last Tuesday, are all getting stacked into this self-world model that we're putting onto the world. And then that's what we're acting from. One of the big, to say it in a similar but maybe slightly different way, is then I'm assuming that everyone else is seeing that same world, right? And if I'm talking to you and you're not seeing that same world, now you and I are having a disagreement. Having the realization that not only am I doing this to whatever degree, I'm bringing my whole history and my whole knowledge and my whole thing onto this moment. We talked at one point about how that self-world model can be so thick that we're pasting it on, and then the actual people in the room are really just props in the story of my mental model, right? Like I have a meaning for what my dad is and what my friend is and all these things, and then that actual person over there is just a pointer for me to trigger all my old knowledge about that person, right? So if I'm doing that, guess what? My dad's doing that too, and my friend is doing that too, and so is everybody else you know. And so this idea that we're all like relating to the exact same reality is not actually what's happening at all. We're actually relating to our projections onto reality with all this knowing and old perceptions and kind of baggage of these assumptive platforms and heuristics and lenses and all that stuff that we're doing. And so again, it's not getting free to get that exactly right. Like the impulse here is like, okay, well, how can I learn to see all of that and never be wrong? That is something we can maybe aspire to and move toward. But the more meaningful thing to do is simply to see that that's happening, and then also realize that other people are doing that too, so that when you have a disagreement, there's a way to navigate through that or understand it. And so let's say you're with people that nobody else knows they're doing that at all, right? Well, you're in a better position because you see that they're doing it. If you're asking them to stop doing it, that you might be exhausted, right? They may not be able to put down their assumptions. They may stick to them very, very heavily. No, you don't understand. That political candidate is the worst. And, you know, all that different stuff, right? Fact, 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 fact. But I might just say, well, that's your opinion. That's your opinion. That's your opinion. Right. And that leads to more disagreements. That can be exhausting if you're doing all this work to see your own construction of reality happening. As more people can see that they're doing the construction, we start to lead to much better communicating amongst people to say, oh, that's just how I saw it. And maybe you're right. What do you think? And that's, to your point, how you can start having better conversations and have that default to like, well, let's learn. I mean, what is your model? What did you hear that I didn't hear? Or what do you know that I don't know? Right. And we can explore that. But none of those things as necessarily fact. They're all perceptions and you know, different levels of usefulness of those perceptions, obviously. But you know, we're doing a lot of painting of models onto reality, and we don't see that we're doing it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the ultimate kind of benefit here of this is that you're greatly reducing your suffering. I mean, if we defined suffering as, I think you've defined it as resisting what is unnecessary, suffering is maybe unnecessarily resisting aggressively against something that is or not. Like, if you can see that, like, when to, like, for example, if you said something that kind of triggered me, or I'm like, oh, I don't know how you could say that, or I don't know how you, like, with that tone and all, I put all this meaning on it, like, but it is my own perception of like what reality is. Another example, when you've given a lot, is when your boss looks at you a certain way, right? It has all this meaning. Oh, on it, because you're also my boss. So
Yeah.
it's like a you know, how much I suffer from that is up to me, right? Because it's like, if I can, for me, a shortcut is like, oh, even let's say your tone was like kind of aggressive and you did give me a look and you really meant it. That's coming from your construction of what reality is and what you're perceiving, right? So if I am like, even, you know, what you said, without judging it as right, it has to be right or whatever, but it's like, oh, what's the value here? How can I see what you saw that made you, you know, have that reaction that I interpreted and put into my, you know, reality, my model?
Yeah.
I can guarantee I'm going to suffer way less than if I'm walk away thinking, oh my gosh, I wish he didn't look at me like that. I wish he didn't
Yeah.
have to say
Yeah.
it like that. Like, right. Because one is making my then reality resist. Like, I wish it wasn't that, or how
Hmm.
could he do that, or blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And the other is just like it's open curiosity that I would imagine by the end of, that conversation with you, you and I have become closer,
Yeah.
right? It's
Totally.
more unifying
Well,
thing. So it is
think
really
about
important.
it's really important. I mean, think about what the possibility this affords for really having empathy. So if I realize that your perception of me isn't necessarily accurate, but it's accurately your perception, right? Like the maybe the error here would be to just think, oh, you have reality wrong, right? And I can't believe that you have reality wrong, and then I'm over here trying to prove a different reality than you. Like, my reality is now fighting with your reality. Instead, if I can put down my reality and actually try to understand what you're seeing and why, with a real maturity of, it doesn't even have to be right, I'm just trying to understand your genuine modeling that you're doing. Like, what did you hear and what did that mean to you and why? And I just hold that alone. Now I have real space to care about your perception and care about how you saw it, and maybe find the words to go, well, okay, that's not actually how I meant it, and I'm sorry you took it that way, and whatever. But I can really honor what your perception is, what your feelings were, what got triggered in you, all those things, instead of just doing this battle where, why can't you see what I see, right? Why can't you know that that's not, of course I didn't mean that, and whatever. And then we're just splitting now.
We're just
But
splitting,
I'm
right?
allowed to, I'm allowing, or I'm opening to my own ability to put down my own model and really try to take on your model and go, how can I understand this, right? And just think politically, like, how can we do that? And I think if we get better at doing that, that's how we can really hear, well, what is under some of these, what we might think of as crazy other side ideologies. Well, let's actually have a heartfelt conversation, not from a place of, I'm going to win you over and move your thing, but I really want to understand, what's your model? What are you seeing? And clearly, on some level, some of those might be really unhealthily, quote unquote, crazy, right? They're truly bad at modeling reality. But I think what you'll find is, if you did that earnestly and really tried to understand that, you would start to hear things and you go, wow, from your point of view, I would feel very similarly. I don't know that I'd take the same behaviors or make the same choices after that, but I get the feeling, I get the notion, and I can see how you've been triggered into this kind of response or whatever. And that's going to lead us to understanding each other better, understanding how people are seeing, how people are perceiving. And the first move of this, just to stay kind of on topic for this talk, our perceptions are very, very, very flawed, right? Like, out of the system. We are not set for seeing truth exactly as it is. We're set to perceive things for fitness. And some of that fitness perception is to bolster myself up and kind of fib about my accomplishments, because that makes me more attractive to the opposite sex, or whatever those things are. And we forget that those are ways of being for fitness that really have nothing to do with being honest or being in reality, etc. Right? So we're all,
and we don't live in the same, right? Like, we talked about, technology has changed kind of what world we're living in, and what skills we need to have that are different than, like, we'll say, the caveman days or something.
yeah.
So it's like, what really does matter. And I think that whole example that you just gave of, like, being able to have more empathy and more growth and more connection. I mean, when you say, so much of us are more delusional than we think, and reality isn't as, real or right as we think, that's what you're saying. Like, the potential there for us to kind of break up with that allows space to have these, like, more wonderful things, not to, like, kind of leave people spinning, like, oh my gosh, well, then
Yeah.
what do I trust and what do I do? Like, it's like, no, like, see how that can leave more space for that then connection. And it's not, again, about being right. It's not about me being swayed by your perceptions or your reality, or me being, like, not having morals or beliefs or values of my own, but it's about the kind of, like, we talked about wisdom, to bring it back to
Mm-hmm.
wisdom. It's the wisdom to see more. We talked
Mm-hmm.
about blind spots with your
Yeah.
thumb, going
Yeah.
back to that example to compare. It's to be able to see more and have less blind spots in my meaning making.
Yeah, totally. And so you were talking before about like living in our own spaces, right? Our default there is to then think about Sarah in a space. But I want to back us up even further. Like Sarah's space is actually between her ears, like it's inside her skull, right? Sarah's space is relating to whatever's out here as reality. But your whole construction is not just like where you're living and the colors you're seeing. It's like the whole construction that's going on in your head, right? And so mine is going on in my head. And once we really realize that we're way less in this shared reality, we're all doing this modeling thing about reality, and those models are deeply conflicting. Yes, that allows us this collective potential for empathy and sharing and understanding of each other much more deeply. But prior to that, on the individual level, it's your own model that's causing your own stuckness as well. That's where all your own limiting beliefs live. And that's where your own, persistent anxiety or depression or whatever, it's from that meaning making model that you're doing in your own head. And so as we can see that we're doing that, right? Not so much to get it exactly right away. You can get better at it. You can start seeing and modeling and doing these things better. That's what this work is. But the first move is just the realization that you're doing that and that everyone else is doing it too. And then not so much just by default believing your own interpretation as 100% accurate, right? That's an enormous move all by itself that then allows you to put it down, perceive differently about yourself, perceive differently about others, take on others' perceptions as best you can, understand really where they're coming from. And this heals a whole lot of things. It makes mental health a whole lot easier to navigate. And ultimately all the societal issues that we're facing get a whole lot easier to fix also.
Yeah. And it starts with the fundamental shift and it moves into skill of identity shifting, and then it creates a societal shift.
There it is.
So that's definitely what we're up to.
There it is.
Over here.
Good. Awesome. So any other points that we didn't cover that you wanted to get to?
No, I think that was a good kind of different perspective on meaning making, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a different entrance point into what we've been talking about on this podcast. And I hope it helps give everyone else kind of a new thoughts on it. And let us know if you have thoughts. We'd love to
Awesome.
hear from you.
Love it.
You can email us at support@robscott.com or leave comments on Instagram, Facebook,
wherever.
Spotify. We're here. Yeah.
Awesome. Good stuff. So, all right. Thank you guys. Appreciate your time and attention. Be kind to yourself and everybody else. We'll be back really soon. Bye-bye.